The rain hammered against the cracked windshield of Marcus Webb's 1998 Ford Ranger, each drop a reminder of another night without shelter. He sat in the parking lot of the county foreclosure office, staring at the steering wheel with hands that still trembled from the nightmares. 42 years old, 8 years in the Marine Corps, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and now this living in a truck with $73 to his name and a Purple Heart that couldn't pay for a motel room. The wipers struggled against the November downpour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Their rhythmic squeak matching the tempo of his racing thoughts. Through the passenger window, he could see other people hurrying into the building, clutching folders and hope. Regular people with regular lives, buying regular properties at foreclosure auctions. Not desperate veterans trying to survive another winter in a vehicle that barely ran. Marcus hadn't planned to be here. 3 months ago, he'd been employed, had an apartment, was finally getting his life together. After years of struggling with PTSD and the invisible wounds that followed him home from Helmand Province, then the factory closed. The rent went unpaid. The eviction notice came, and just like that, the fragile stability he'd built collapsed like a house of cards in a strong wind. His phone buzzed, 2% battery remaining. One more thing running on empty. He'd charged it at the library yesterday. Spent hours applying for jobs that would never call back. A college dropout with a medical discharge and a gap in his employment history wasn't exactly what employers were looking for, no matter how many times they thanked him for his service. The rain intensified, drumming harder against the metal roof. Marcus thought about starting the engine, getting warm, but gas cost money he didn't have. The gauge had been hovering near empty for 2 days. He'd been rationing his remaining cash, $47 for food, $26 for gas, hoping to stretch it until something, anything, broke his way. Through the foggy windshield, he watched a family exit the foreclosure office, their faces bright with excitement. A young couple with a toddler, clutching paperwork, probably just bought their first home at a bargain price. Marcus felt a hollow ache in his chest. That should have been him and Sarah, back before the war changed everything. Back before she realized the man who came home wasn't the same one who'd left. A sharp knock on his window made him startle, hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. An elderly man in a raincoat peered through the glass, concern etched on his weathered face. Marcus rolled down the window a few inches, rain immediately soaking the doorframe. "You okay, son?" The old man's voice carried genuine worry. "You've been sitting here for over an hour." "I'm fine, sir. Just thinking." Marcus managed a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. The man studied him for a long moment, taking in the Marine Corps sticker on the rear window, the duffel bag stuffed with belongings in the truck bed, the hollow look of someone who'd lost more than possessions. "Veteran?" Marcus nodded. "Marines?" "Yes, sir. 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines." The old man's expression softened. "My son served. Iraq, 2005. Didn't make it home." He reached into his coat and pulled out a business card, pressing it through the window opening. "If you need help, real help, this organization assists veterans. They're good people. They actually care." Marcus accepted the card, though he'd already been to 3 veteran services organizations and exhausted their limited resources. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate it." The man lingered, clearly wanting to say more, but finally just nodded and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the relentless rain. He looked at the card, Veterans Housing Alliance, Denver, then tucked it into his shirt pocket. Maybe tomorrow. Right now, he had bigger problems. The foreclosure auction was about to start, and he'd driven all the way here because the listing he'd found online had caught his attention in a way nothing else had in months. Abandoned Riverside train station, built 1904, as is condition. Starting bid, $50. $50. The kind of money people spent on dinner without thinking. The kind of money that, for Marcus, represented nearly 3 days of food. But the listing photos had shown something that sparked a desperate hope: walls, a roof, space, not a home, but shelter. A place where he wouldn't have to sleep in a truck, constantly worried about being rousted by police or robbed in the night. The smart thing would be to keep that $73, stretch it as far as possible while he kept job hunting. But Marcus had learned in the Marines that sometimes you had to take calculated risks, push forward when everyone else held back. This felt like one of those moments, probably stupid, definitely desperate, but possibly his only chance at something better than slowly freezing in a parking lot. He grabbed his worn Marine Corps jacket, pulled the hood over his head, and stepped into the rain. The cold immediately penetrated his thin clothes, but he was used to being uncomfortable. Combat had taught him to function through far worse than November rain. Inside the foreclosure office, fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over a room full of bargain hunters and speculators. Marcus took a seat in the back row, hyper-aware of how he must look unshaven, clothes that had been worn too many days in a row, the hollow-eyed appearance of someone living on the edge. A few people glanced at him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. He kept his gaze forward, jaw set. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a monotone voice, worked through the properties with efficient disinterest. Residential homes, commercial lots, abandoned buildings, each one going to the highest bidder as the rain continued its assault on the windows. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, barely, looking up from his papers. Former Riverside train station, 1447 Railroad Avenue, built 1904, abandoned since 1983. Property sold as is, no warranties, no utilities, no certificate of occupancy. Buyer assumes all liability, code violations, and environmental remediation costs. Property is likely condemned and may require demolition. Starting bid, $50. The room went silent. No raised hands, no interest. Marcus felt his heart hammering. This was it, his moment to do something unbelievably stupid or potentially life-saving. $50, he said, his voice stronger than he felt. The auctioneer's eyes found him, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. We have 50. Do I hear 60? Silence stretched across the room. People shifted uncomfortably. Nobody willing to spend money on a building that was probably one inspection away from demolition. Going once, going twice. Sold to bidder 43 for $50. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Marcus felt dizzy. He'd just spent the majority of his remaining money on a building he'd never seen in person. That was probably structurally unsound, definitely had no working utilities, and might not even be legally habitable. He'd either just made the best decision of his life, or signed his own death warrant for the coming winter. 20 minutes later, he stood outside the foreclosure office, holding a bill of sale and a set of keys that looked like they'd been forged in the previous century. The rain had let up to a steady drizzle, and somewhere through the clouds, the sun was trying to break through. The address was only 15 miles away, through neighborhoods that grew progressively more run down as he drove, his truck's engine coughing ominously. The GPS on his dying phone led him through a former industrial district, where boarded-up warehouses stood like monuments to better economic times. And then, he saw it. The Riverside train station rose from the overgrown lot like a Gothic cathedral dedicated to transportation's golden age. 3 stories of red brick, darkened by decades of weathering and neglect. Arched windows, most broken or boarded over. A slate roof partially collapsed on the eastern side. The platform, where thousands of passengers had once waited, now cracked and split, weeds forcing their way through concrete. It was magnificent and heartbreaking all at once. Marcus parked the truck. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And just stared, taking in what he'd bought for less than the cost of a tank of gas. The building had been beautiful once. That was clear, ornate architectural details, grand scale, the kind of solid construction from an era when things were built to last. Now it stood as a hollow shell, forgotten by a city that had moved on. He approached slowly, keys gripped in his hand, half expecting the whole structure to collapse at his presence. The main doors were massive oak, reinforced with iron bands, locked with a padlock that had rusted nearly shut. It took him 10 minutes of work with WD-40 from his truck's emergency kit before the lock finally gave way. The doors groaned open, protesting decades of disuse, revealing the main concourse beyond. Even in its derelict state, the space took Marcus's breath away. The main hall soared 3 stories high, topped by a vaulted ceiling where skylights, now mostly broken, had once flooded the space with natural light. The ticket windows stood empty, their brass fixtures tarnished green. Wooden benches, those that hadn't been stolen or burned for warmth by previous squatters, lined the walls. Graffiti covered every surface within arm's reach, layers of spray paint chronicling decades of vandalism. But beneath the decay, Marcus could see the building's bones solid, construction, thick walls, good structural elements that had survived a century. This wasn't just shelter, this was a fortress, built in an age when craftsmanship mattered more than cost-cutting. His footsteps echoed as he crossed the main floor, disturbing pigeons that had made the upper levels their home. Rat droppings suggested he wasn't the first mammal to find refuge here. The smell was a combination of mildew, bird waste, and decades of accumulated dust. But Marcus had lived in far worse conditions in Afghanistan. This was manageable. He spent the afternoon exploring, cataloging what he'd bought. The main concourse, vast and echoing. The second-floor offices, some with doors still intact, others just empty frames. The third floor, partially collapsed, too dangerous to fully explore without proper equipment. The basement locked behind a heavy door that his keys didn't fit. As the November sun began its early descent, casting long shadows through broken windows, Marcus made a crucial decision. He gathered dry wood from collapsed sections of the roof, cleared a safe area in one of the second-floor offices, and built a fire in an old metal trash can. It wasn't much, but it was the first time in 3 months he'd been warm indoors. That night, wrapped in his sleeping bag with his back against a wall and his truck parked as close to the building as possible, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. A small spark of hope. This building was a disaster. It would take years and money he didn't have to make it truly livable. But it was his. For the first time since the eviction, he had a place that belonged to him, where nobody could tell him to move along or threaten him with arrest for vagrancy. He pulled out his phone, now at 1% battery, and looked at the photo he kept as his wallpaper. Him and his Marine Corps unit, all of them grinning, dirty, exhausted, alive. 7 faces in that photo. 3 of them didn't make it home. The others had scattered to different corners of the country, most dealing with their own demons. "Well, guys," Marcus whispered to the empty room, "I bought a train station today. Pretty sure I'm officially insane. But at least I've got a roof over my head. That's something, right?" His phone died before he could say more, leaving him in darkness, broken only by the glow of his small fire. Outside, the rain started again, but for the first time in months, Marcus fell asleep dry and relatively warm. He woke to pale November sunlight streaming through the broken windows, and the realization that he now owned a building but had exactly $23 remaining to his name. No electricity, no running water, no way to heat the massive space. Winter was coming, and with it, the very real possibility that this gamble would kill him. The harsh morning light revealed details he'd missed the previous evening. The damage was more extensive than he'd initially thought. Water stains, suggesting active leaks, sections of floor that felt dangerously soft. evidence of previous fires set by other homeless people who'd found temporary shelter here. But there was also potential. The basic structure was sound. Those old brick walls and timber framing had survived a century and could survive more. The roof, while damaged, was mostly intact. Most importantly, the building had space, vast amounts of space that could be repurposed, divided, utilized. Marcus spent the morning exploring areas he'd avoided in the darkness. The platform outside offered a covered area where he could work on his truck without being exposed to weather. A side room that might have been a restaurant kitchen still had industrial shelving and some old equipment, nothing functional, but materials he could repurpose. And then he found the maintenance corridor, hidden behind a door he'd initially missed, camouflaged by decades of grime and a layer of graffiti that made it blend into the wall, was a narrow passage that led to the service areas. Marcus's military training kicked in as he evaluated the corridor defensible. Single point of entry, good sight lines, tactically sound, which seemed absurd to think about in an abandoned train station, but old habits died hard. The corridor led to a series of small rooms, staff quarters, storage areas, a bathroom with fixtures from the 1950 seconds that somehow still held water in the pipes. Marcus turned the ancient faucet, not expecting anything, and nearly jumped when brown water sputtered out, ran rusty for a minute, then cleared to a steady stream. Running water, probably not safe to drink without boiling, but running water nonetheless. This changed everything. He followed the corridor deeper, finding a door marked Freight Office, authorized personnel only. The lock was newer than the others, industrial grade, installed maybe 20 years ago, judging by the style. None of his keys fit, but Marcus had learned basic lock-picking in the Marines. It took him 15 minutes, and a pair of makeshift tools fashioned from wire coat hangers he'd found, but he got it open. Beyond was a small office, surprisingly well preserved, a desk, filing cabinets, and against the far wall, something that made Marcus's breath catch, a safe. Not a small personal safe, but a massive commercial vault. The kind banks had used in the early 1900s, built directly into the brick wall. The safe door bore the logo of Adams Security Systems, Denver, and a serial number that put its installation around 1908. The dial combination lock was sophisticated for its era, and unlike the modern deadbolt on the office door, this hadn't been tampered with. Whoever had abandoned this building had apparently forgotten about this office entirely. Marcus spent the next hour examining the safe, trying to understand what he'd found. The vault was easily 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, built to last centuries. Whatever was inside had been sealed away for decades, possibly longer. He tried a few obvious combinations. 1234, 0000. Birth dates from the building's history he could remember from the listing, but nothing worked. As the afternoon sun shifted position, Marcus made a decision. He'd spent in his last dollars on this building. He was committed now. For better or worse, the safe represented a mystery, but it was a mystery that would have to wait. First, he needed to survive. He spent the rest of the day making his situation more manageable. Using materials scavenged from the building, he reinforced the windows in the freight office, creating a somewhat secure living space. He established a proper toilet situation, using the ancient bathroom fixtures, boiling water from the taps to make it safe for washing. The $23 in his pocket bought a bag of rice, a dozen eggs, and a half-gallon of milk from a dollar store 2 miles away. Not much, but enough for a few days if he was careful. He'd eaten less in worse circumstances. That night, as he boiled water over another small fire in the freight office, Marcus found himself staring at the massive safe. What would a train station need to secure in 1908? Payroll records, valuable freight, company documents? Probably nothing of value. After all these years, just moldering paper and historical artifacts, worth nothing to anyone but a museum. But something about it nagged at him. The safe's placement, hidden in a freight office rather than displayed prominently like the ticket windows. The newer lock on the office door, suggesting someone had been here relatively recently, securing the space. The complete absence of any attempt to breach the vault itself, as if nobody had known it existed. Over the next week, Marcus fell into a routine. Mornings spent job hunting at the public library 2 miles away, a walk that kept him in shape and saved gas. Afternoons working on the building, making it more livable, learning its secrets. Evenings huddled in the freight office, trying to piece together the train station's history. The library yielded unexpected information. The Riverside train station had been a major hub until the 1960 seconds, when changing transportation patterns made it obsolete. It sat abandoned for 2 decades, before a development company bought it in 1982, intending to convert it to a shopping center. That project had failed. The company went bankrupt, and the building had sat empty ever since, passing through various hands at foreclosure auctions. But what caught Marcus's attention was a newspaper article from 1953. A robbery at the station. Armed men had held up a freight shipment, stealing what the article described as valuable materials in transit. The thieves were never caught. The freight was never recovered. The article was vague on details, but it mentioned the station manager had implemented enhanced security measures following the incident. Marcus stared at that article for a long time, his mind making connections. 1953. Enhanced security. A massive safe hidden in a freight office. What if the enhanced security hadn't been about preventing another robbery, but about hiding something that was already there? He returned to the station with renewed determination, examining the safe from every angle. The combination dial had 99 positions, meaning millions of possible combinations. He could spend years trying random numbers and never crack it. He needed to think smarter. What would a station manager in 1953 use as a combination? Something memorable but not obvious. Something connected to the railroad, the building, or the era. Marcus started with the building's construction date 1904. Tried it forward, backward, in different positions. Nothing. He tried significant railroad dates. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Major route openings. Nothing. For 2 weeks, he worked on the safe whenever he wasn't job hunting or improving his living situation. And for 2 weeks, the vault kept its secrets. Then one afternoon, frustrated and exhausted from another series of rejections at job interviews, Marcus sat in the freight office, staring at the safe with burning eyes. His money had run out 3 days ago. He'd been surviving on rice and rainwater, his stomach cramping from hunger. The November cold had deepened, and his small fires barely kept the chill at bay. This was it, the moment of truth. Either he figured out how to survive the winter here, or he'd freeze to death in a building nobody would check until spring. Some part of him wondered if that wouldn't be easier than continuing to struggle. The war had taught him to embrace the suck, but there was a limit to how much suffering one person could endure. His eyes fell on the Adams Security Systems logo on the safe. On impulse, he pulled out his dying phone. He'd been saving its last 15% of battery for emergencies and did a search. Adams Security Systems, established 1887, headquartered in Denver, a family company that had dominated the safe industry in the western United States, until being acquired by a larger corporation in the 1970 seconds. He dug deeper, finding historical records. Adams safes had a unique feature: factory-set combinations that were recorded in the company ledgers but could be reset by owners. If this safe had never been reset, Marcus found what he was looking for in a digital archive of historical business records. A ledger from Adams Security Systems, 1908, showing safe installations in Colorado. Each entry included the client name, safe model, and a 4-digit service code. His hands shook as he scrolled through the ledger. There, Riverside Train Station, safe model C47. Service code 4719. Service codes weren't combinations, but they were related. Common practice in that era was to use the service code as the last 4 digits of a longer combination, with the first digits being something site-specific. The building number? Marcus tried to remember from the title documents. 1447 Railroad Avenue. He approached the safe, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it echoing in the empty office. Carefully, he began turning the dial. 144-74719. On the final number, he heard something, the faintest click of tumblers falling into place. Marcus gripped the handle, half expecting nothing, preparing himself for another disappointment in a life full of them. He pulled. The handle moved. The massive door, weighing hundreds of pounds, swung open with a groan of protest from hinges that hadn't moved in decades. Inside was darkness. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, one of the few possessions he still had from his military days, and shined it into the vault. The beam illuminated stacks upon stacks of wooden crates, each one carefully labeled with typed cards under metal holders. The cards bore dates spanning from 1942 to 1953. Shipping manifests with cryptic codes, and one word that appeared on every single crate: classified. Marcus pulled out the nearest crate, his military experience immediately recognizing official government packaging. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them surprisingly well, were documents. Not just any documents. Military contracts, transport, manifests, and, beneath, those bearer bonds. Bearer bonds. The financial instrument that belonged to whoever physically possessed them. No names, no records, as good as cash. And these weren't ordinary bonds, they were issued by the U.S. Treasury, dated between 1944 and 1951, denomination clearly printed on each certificate: $100,000. Marcus's hands shook as he pulled out another crate. More bonds, all identical denominations. He started counting crates, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. 12 crates on the bottom row. He climbed into the vault. It was deep enough to stand in, and discovered 4 more rows stacked behind. 60 crates total. He opened 3 more at random, confirming they all contained the same thing: bearer bonds. $100,000 each. Approximately 50 bonds per crate, if the packing was consistent. His brain struggled with the mathematics. 60 crates, 50 bonds per crate, 3,000 bonds, 3,000 times $100,000, $300 million. The flashlight slipped from his fingers, clattering on the floor of the vault. Marcus sat down hard, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. People didn't buy buildings for $50 and find $300 million in government bonds hidden in forgotten safes. Things like this didn't happen to homeless veterans living in trucks. This was insanity. But the bonds were real. The crates were real. The serial numbers and official seals were authentic. His hands were actually holding a piece of paper that represented $100,000 more money than he'd earned in the past 5 years combined. Beneath the shock, a different emotion began to emerge. Not joy, not relief, but fear. Cold, rational, tactical fear. Because Marcus's military training kicked in with a simple question. Why were $300 million in bearer bonds hidden in a train station freight office? He examined the shipping manifests more carefully. The bonds had been in transit through multiple stations during World War II and the early Cold War, part of what the documents described as discretionary funding for classified programs. They were supposed to have been delivered to various federal facilities, but had apparently been diverted here. By whom? And why hadn't they been recovered? Marcus found a partial answer in a water-damaged notebook tucked into one of the crates. The handwriting was shaky, the entries spanning just a few weeks in 1953. April 3rd. The shipment is secure. Henderson says, the investigation is closing in. We can't let them find what we've diverted. The money was supposed to fund weapons programs. But we've been skimming for 5 years. If caught, it's treason. April 15th. Henderson and Miller are dead. Made to look like a car accident, but I know better. Someone is cleaning house. I'm next. April 22nd. Moved the bonds to the station safe. Nobody knows about the freight office. Will retrieve once the heat dies down. If something happens to me, this notebook is the only record. The combination is the building address plus company code. Whoever finds this, be careful. These bonds are bought with blood. The final entry was dated April 24th, 1953. The newspaper article about the station robbery had been dated April 25th, and the station manager mentioned in that article had disappeared shortly after, presumed to have absconded with the stolen freight. But he hadn't stolen anything. He'd hidden evidence of a larger conspiracy and then vanished, probably murdered like the others. And the bonds had sat here for 70 years, forgotten, while the train station decayed around them. Marcus sat in the vault until darkness fell, his mind racing through scenarios. These bonds were still valid. Bearer bonds didn't expire. They were technically anonymous. But $300 million in century-old government securities would trigger immediate attention if anyone tried to redeem them. There would be questions, investigations, and if powerful people had killed to keep this secret 70 years ago, their modern equivalents wouldn't hesitate to do the same. He couldn't just walk into a bank and cash them. He couldn't call the authorities, who knew how deep the original conspiracy had reached. For all he knew, the bonds had been hidden by people at the highest levels of government, during an era when classified programs operated with zero oversight. But he also couldn't ignore them. This money represented everything: safety, security, the ability to help other veterans struggling like him, the ability to actually live instead of just survive. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He reinforced the office door, moved a filing cabinet in front of the vault, and sat with his back against the wall, a tire iron from his truck in his lap, watching the shadows and trying to figure out what the hell he was going to do. Morning brought no easy answers, but it did bring clarity. Marcus couldn't handle this alone. He needed help from someone he could trust, someone who understood how dangerous this situation could become. His first call was to Tommy Rodriguez, a former Marine from his unit who'd gotten out a year before Marcus and was now working construction in Denver. They'd kept sporadic contact, the kind of bond that military service created. You might not talk for months, but when one of you needed help, you answered. Tommy arrived 2 days later, took one look at the bonds, and whistled low. "Hermano, you found a fortune or a death warrant?" "Maybe both." "I'm leaning toward death warrant," Marcus admitted. "I need help figuring out what to do with this. Who I can trust." Tommy made a call to someone he knew, who made a call to someone else. Within a week, Marcus found himself sitting in a diner across from Grace Chen, a former military lawyer who'd transitioned to working with a veterans advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. Grace listened to the entire story without interruption, occasionally taking notes, her expression revealing nothing. When Marcus finished, she sat back and studied him with intense dark eyes. "Mr. Webb, do you understand the magnitude of what you found? I found $300 million in bonds that are probably connected to classified government programs from the Cold War, hidden by people who were killed to keep them secret." "Yeah, I'd say I understand the magnitude." Grace smiled slightly at his bluntness. "These bonds, if authenticated, represent one of the largest missing assets cases in U.S. history. There have been rumors for decades about diverted World War II funding, classified programs that operated outside normal oversight, money that disappeared into black budgets. but no proof. Until now. So, what do I do? Marcus felt the weight of exhaustion settling over him. I bought a building for $50 because I needed shelter. I didn't ask for this. I don't want to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. You have 3 options, Grace said, counting them on her fingers. 1. You destroy the bonds and walk away. You lose the money, but you're safe. 2. You try to redeem them quietly through private channels. You'd get maybe 30 cents on the dollar from collectors who don't ask questions, assuming they don't just kill you and take them. 3. You go public. You authenticate them through official channels, document everything, and force transparency. Option 3 sounds like a good way to get murdered by whoever wants these bonds to stay hidden. Option 3 also protects you, Grace countered. Once this is public knowledge, killing you accomplishes nothing. The truth is already out. And if these bonds are authenticated as part of a historical government program, there are whistleblower protections and recovery rewards that could net you a significant percentage. Marcus thought about this, his tactical mind evaluating risks and benefits. How significant a percentage? 10 to 20% of recovered assets is standard for whistleblowers who expose government fraud or recover lost federal property. Even at 10%, you're looking at $30 million. Plus, the precedent this sets could help recover other Cold War-era assets, benefit other veterans, force accountability for how military funds were handled. $30 million. Not $300 million, but enough to change his life. Enough to never be homeless again. Enough to help other veterans who'd been forgotten by the system that promised to take care of them. What do I need to do? Over the next 3 weeks, Grace coordinated a careful strategy. They documented everything, photographed every bond, recorded every serial number, made copies of all shipping manifests, and the damning notebook entries. They established a clear chain of custody, ensuring that Marcus's legitimate purchase of the property was unquestionable. Then Grace made the first call, directly to the Treasury Department's Inspector General office, bypassing normal channels that might be compromised. She laid out the basic facts. A civilian had legally purchased a property and discovered what appeared to be significant lost government assets in a secured vault. The assets needed authentication and proper chain of custody investigation. The response was swift. Within 48 hours, federal agents arrived at the train station. Not threatening, not hostile, but professional investigators doing their job, documenting evidence of what might be the largest recovery of lost Cold War assets in history. Marcus watched them photograph the vault, catalog the crates, run serial numbers through databases. He provided his statement, carefully prepared with Grace's help, sticking to facts and avoiding speculation about the conspiracy that had hidden these bonds 70 years ago. The lead investigator, a woman named Sarah Martinez with the Treasury Department, spent hours examining the notebook and shipping manifests. Finally, she looked up at Marcus with something like, "Respect. Mr. Webb, these bonds are authentic. The serial numbers match a batch that was reported lost in transit in 1953, part of funding for classified defense programs during the Korean War. The official story was that they were stolen in a train robbery, but these documents suggest they were diverted by insiders and hidden." "Will there be an investigation?" Marcus asked. "There will be multiple investigations. The Justice Department will want to examine the evidence of conspiracy and possible murder. The Treasury will audit the historical records. Congress will probably hold hearings about oversight failures that allowed this to happen." Martinez paused. "This is going to be a major story. Mr. Webb, your life is about to change significantly. It already changed when I became homeless," Marcus said quietly. "I'm just hoping it changes for the better this time." The story broke 3 days later, not because Marcus wanted publicity, but because Grace understood that transparency was his best protection. A carefully coordinated release to major news organizations, Homeless veteran discovers $300 million in lost government bonds in abandoned train station. The media response was overwhelming. News trucks camped outside the train station. Reporters wanted interviews. Congressional representatives issued statements praising Marcus as a patriotic citizen who'd done the right thing. The Treasury Department fast-tracked the authentication process, confirming that all bonds were genuine and still valid. And then came the whistleblower reward hearing. Marcus stood before a federal judge, Grace at his side, as government lawyers argued about appropriate compensation. The Treasury Department proposed 10%, $30 million. Marcus's advocates pushed for 20%, given the historical significance of the recovery and the danger he'd potentially faced. The judge split the difference, 15% of the total recovered assets, accounting for the bond's current value, with 70 years of accumulated interest, $47.5 million to Marcus Webb, to be paid out over 5 years with appropriate tax considerations. But the money, while life-changing, wasn't what mattered most in that moment. What mattered was the judge's final statement. Mr. Webb, you purchased an abandoned building because you were homeless and desperate. You could have kept these bonds quiet, tried to profit illegally, endangered yourself and others. Instead, you did what we ask all citizens to do. You brought evidence of wrongdoing to light. You served your country in war, and you've served it again in peace. Thank you. Marcus didn't cry during the hearing, didn't cry during the press conference afterward, didn't cry during the interviews or the photo shoots or the endless questions about how it felt to go from homeless to millionaire overnight. But later that night, sitting alone in the train station, his property, his shelter that had given him so much more than just a roof, Marcus finally let the emotions overwhelm him. He thought about the judge's words, about serving his country, about doing the right thing even when easier options existed. He thought about the station manager who'd hidden the bonds 70 years ago and probably died for it. About all the veterans he'd served with, some who came home, some who didn't. About Tommy and the Veterans Advocacy Organization that had helped him navigate this impossible situation. And he made a decision. Tommy found him the next morning sitting in the main concourse, staring at the broken skylights where morning sun was trying to break through. "You okay, man?" Tommy sat beside him, following his gaze upward. "I'm going to fix this place," Marcus said. "Not just patch it up to live here. Actually, restore it. Make it into something useful. Marcus, you're about to be rich. You could buy any house you want. Hell, you could buy 10 houses. I don't want houses. I want this." Marcus gestured around the decaying grandeur. This station served people for 60 years, gave them shelter, got them where they needed to go. Then it was abandoned, left to rot. That's what happened to me after the war. Left to rot, forgotten by the system that was supposed to take care of me. He turned to look at his friend. What if we made this into a place for veterans? Transitional housing, job training, mental health services. A place where guys like us don't have to sleep in trucks or wonder where the next meal is coming from. A place that actually helps instead of just processing paperwork and giving speeches about thanking us for our service. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "That's going to take more than money, hermano. That's going to take permits, contractors, bureaucrats, years of work. Good thing I've got time and money now." Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed in months. "Besides, what else am I going to do? Buy a mansion and live alone while other veterans freeze in parking lots? That's not who I am." The Riverside Veterans Center opened 2 years later. The train station, lovingly restored to its original glory, now housed 50 transitional apartments for homeless veterans, a job training center, mental health services, and a community space for meetings and meals. The main concourse, with its repaired skylights and polished floors, served as a gathering place where veterans could find community instead of isolation. Marcus lived in a modest apartment on the 3rd floor, the same floor that had been partially collapsed when he first arrived. He'd watched every step of the restoration, hired veterans for much of the work, learned about construction and historic preservation, and the bureaucratic maze of non-profit organizations. The $47.5 million had been carefully managed. $20 million went into the center's construction and renovation. $10 million into an endowment to ensure long-term operation. $5 million into a network of similar facilities in other cities. The rest was invested wisely, providing Marcus with an income, but more importantly, with resources to help other veterans. Grace Chen joined the center's board of directors, bringing her legal expertise and government connections. Tommy Rodriguez became the facility's operations manager, overseeing daily functions and veteran services. They hired former military personnel for most positions, people who understood the challenges because they'd faced them themselves. The media coverage, which had been overwhelming at first, eventually faded to occasional human interest stories. Marcus preferred it that way. He'd never wanted fame, just stability, just a chance to live without the constant fear that had dominated his months of homelessness. On the 2-year anniversary of the center's opening, Marcus stood on the restored platform where he'd once imagined trains that would never arrive. Now it served as an outdoor gathering space, and tonight it was filled with veterans, staff, volunteers, and supporters celebrating what they'd built together. Sarah Martinez, the Treasury investigator who'd authenticated the bonds, approached with a glass of champagne. "Quite a transformation from that day I first saw this place. Couldn't have done it without you believing me," Marcus said. A homeless guy claiming he found $300 million in a train station. Most people would have assumed I was crazy. The evidence spoke for itself. Sarah gestured toward the crowd. "But this is beyond authentication and legal processes. You took a discovery that could have made you wealthy and comfortable, and instead used it to help people who are still struggling. That's rare." Marcus watched Tommy talking with a group of new arrivals, veterans just beginning their journey from homelessness to stability. "I remember what it felt like. That desperation, the cold nights, the constant hunger, the looking in the mirror and not recognizing yourself anymore. If this place prevents even one person from experiencing that, it's worth every penny." Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the center had grown quiet, Marcus walked through the main concourse. His footsteps echoed just as they had that first day, but the sound was different now, not hollow and lonely, but full of purpose and life. He stopped in front of a memorial wall they'd installed, listing names of veterans who'd died homeless in the past decade. Too many names. Too many people who'd slipped through the cracks of a system that was supposed to catch them. But beside that wall was a different list, names of veterans who'd come through the center and successfully transitioned to stable housing and employment. That list grew every month. Small victories against an enormous problem, but victories nonetheless. Marcus thought about the bonds hidden for 70 years, evidence of conspiracy and corruption from an era when oversight barely existed. He thought about the station manager who'd tried to expose the truth and paid with his life, about how one person's desperate attempt to do the right thing had ultimately led to this, a center helping veterans 70 years later. "We did it," he whispered to the empty concourse. "We took something built on secrets and suffering and turned it into something good. You didn't die for nothing." His phone buzzed a text from Grace. "Saw the news coverage of the anniversary. Beautiful ceremony. The work you're doing matters. Never forget that." Marcus smiled, typing back a simple, "Thank you," before pocketing his phone and heading to his apartment. Tomorrow would bring new arrivals, new challenges, the constant work of helping people rebuild their lives. But tonight, standing in a train station he'd bought for $50 and transformed into a beacon of hope, Marcus Webb felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the absence of problems, or struggles, or painful memories from Afghanistan, but the deep, sustaining peace that came from knowing his life had meaning, that his suffering hadn't been wasted. that the train station's secrets had finally been used for their best possible purpose. 3 months later, Marcus received an unexpected visitor, a man in his 70s, impeccably dressed, with military bearing that hadn't faded despite his age. He introduced himself as Colonel Richard Henderson, son of the Henderson mentioned in the notebook, one of the conspirators who'd been killed in 1953. "I've been following the news about your center," the colonel said as they sat in Marcus's modest office. "About the bonds, the restoration, everything you've built here. I felt I owed you the truth about what happened." Marcus gestured for him to continue, curious but cautious. "My father wasn't a thief," Henderson said quietly. "He was a whistleblower. He and several others at the Pentagon discovered that high-ranking officers were diverting funding meant for weapons programs, skimming millions for personal enrichment. When they tried to report it through proper channels, they were silenced. Permanently. The bonds," Marcus said, understanding dawning. "They weren't stolen. They were hidden as evidence." "Exactly. My father knew he was in danger. He moved the bonds to this train station because his friend worked here, the station manager. They planned to expose everything once they had enough evidence. But they were killed before that could happen. The official story, train robbery, missing freight, was a cover-up." Henderson pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. "I found this in my father's safety deposit box after he died. A letter explaining everything, meant to be opened if anything happened to him. I was 12 when he died. By the time I was old enough to understand the letter's significance, the trail was too cold, the conspirators dead or too powerful to touch. I became a military officer myself, spent decades trying to bring honor back to our family name." "Your father was right to blow the whistle," Marcus said. "The notebook we found proved that. The Treasury investigation confirmed significant fraud in classified programs during that era. Which brings me to why I'm here." Henderson handed Marcus a check, $2 million. "This is from my father's estate. Money I inherited but could never spend comfortably, knowing its source. I want it to go to your center, to actually help veterans the way the original funding was supposed to." Marcus stared at the check, overwhelmed. "Colonel, I can't. You can, and you will. My father died trying to protect money meant for military programs. You're using that money exactly as it should have been used, supporting the people who serve. This is how I honor his memory and correct the wrongs of that era." They talked for hours about Henderson's father, about Marcus's journey from homeless veteran to philanthropist, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them both to this moment. Before he left, Henderson paused at the door. "Mr. Webb, my father's final words to my mother were, 'Someone will find the truth eventually. Justice might be delayed, but it doesn't disappear.' He was right. You found it. And you've delivered justice in the best possible way by helping those who need it most." The $2 million donation expanded the center's capacity, allowing them to add specialized programs for veterans struggling with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and addiction. They partnered with local colleges to offer educational opportunities, with businesses to create job placement programs, with mental health professionals to provide comprehensive care. 5 years after finding the bonds, Marcus attended a celebration at the center. They'd just helped their 500th veteran transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment. The main concourse was filled with people, veterans who'd been helped, staff members, volunteers, families. A young veteran named Alex, who'd arrived homeless and suicidal 6 months earlier, stood at the podium sharing his story. "When I got here, I'd lost everything. My job, my apartment, my self-respect. I was sleeping in my car and planning to end it. But this place didn't just give me a bed and meals. It gave me a community, people who understood, people who cared. I have a job now, an apartment, and most importantly, hope. The Riverside Veterans Center saved my life." Marcus watched from the back of the room, refusing to sit on the stage despite the organizers' requests. This wasn't about him. It had never been about him. It was about the 500 veterans they'd helped, and the thousands more they would help in the years to come. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and shared stories, Marcus slipped away to his usual spot, the platform where he'd first imagined what this place could become. Tommy found him there, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You always disappear during these celebrations," Tommy said, handing him a cup. "I'm not good with attention. You know that." "Yeah, but you should be there. You built this, hermano. You took $50 and impossible odds and created something incredible." Marcus sipped his coffee, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I didn't build it alone. And honestly, Tommy, I still can't believe it's real sometimes. I wake up in the morning and have to remind myself that I'm not still sleeping in my truck. That this isn't some elaborate dream my brain created to cope with freezing to death. It's real. 500 veterans whose lives changed because of you. That's as real as it gets." They stood in comfortable silence for a while. 2 former Marines who'd survived war and the different battles that followed. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "You know what the strangest part is? That notebook from 1953, the station manager's last entry. He wrote that whoever found the bonds should be careful because they were bought with blood. He was warning about the conspiracy, the danger, but in a different way. All money is bought with someone's blood, someone's sacrifice. That's dark, man. But true. Those bonds represented money that should have gone to supporting military operations, protecting the people who served. Instead, it was stolen, hidden, forgotten, until a different kind of sacrifice, me losing everything, led to finding them. And now they're finally being used the way they should have been 70 years ago." Tommy considered this. "So you're saying your homelessness was meant to happen? That's some cosmic justice philosophy." "I'm saying nothing is wasted if we choose to give it meaning. My homelessness sucked. It was degrading and terrifying, and came close to killing me. But it led me to this building, to those bonds, to being able to help people. I wouldn't choose to go through it again, but I also wouldn't undo it. Because look what came from it." A young veteran exited the building, saw them on the platform, and waved. Marcus waved back, recognizing Jason, a former Army corporal who'd arrived 3 months ago, with nothing but a backpack and trauma that made sleep nearly impossible. He'd just gotten a job as a mechanic and signed a lease on his first apartment in 2 years. "That right there," Marcus gestured toward Jason. "That's why every cold night in my truck, every job rejection, every moment of desperation was worth it. Because I understand what he's going through. I can look him in the eye and honestly say, I know how dark it gets, and I'm here to tell you it can get better. And he believes me, because he knows I've been where he is." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the center's restored lights clicked on, illuminating the platform and the main building beyond. Someone had planted trees in the once barren lot, and they were starting to fill in, creating a small park where veterans could sit and find moments of peace. Grace Chen emerged from the building, a folder in her hands. She'd become more than the lawyer who'd helped navigate the legal complexity of the bond discovery. She was now the center's general counsel and Marcus's close friend. "Thought I'd find you out here hiding," she said with a smile. "We just got confirmation. The Treasury Department is releasing a final report on the Cold War funding investigation your discovery triggered. They found evidence of fraud, totaling over $800 million across multiple classified programs. 23 officials are facing criminal charges, even though most are posthumous. Congressional hearings start next month. Will they want me to testify?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Almost certainly. You're the person who brought this to light. Your story will be central to understanding why oversight matters, why accountability is crucial." Grace paused. "There's something else. Several other facilities have come forward, claiming they might have similar hidden assets. Your discovery triggered a nationwide audit of Cold War-era properties. If they find more bonds or diverted funds, the Treasury wants to establish a protocol based on your case, authenticate, recover, reward whistleblowers, and direct recovered assets toward veterans programs. So this could happen again? Other people finding hidden money and using it to help veterans? That's the idea. Turn decades-old fraud into current-day support for the people who served. It's poetic justice, really. The money that was stolen from military programs being recovered and actually used to help military personnel. Marcus felt something swell in his chest, not pride exactly, but satisfaction, a sense that the random chaos of his life, the suffering and struggle, had somehow aligned into something meaningful, not because of divine intervention or destiny, but because he'd made choices, small choices at first, spending his last money on a building instead of food, opening the safe instead of walking away, telling the truth instead of trying to profit illegally, each choice leading to the next, creating a path he never could have imagined. The nights grew colder as autumn deepened toward winter. Marcus often walked through the center late at night, when most residents were asleep, checking that everything was secure. Old habits from military service, checking the perimeter, making sure everyone was safe. One particular night, he found a new arrival, sitting in the main concourse, staring at the repaired skylights. The man was in his 30s, gaunt from living on the streets, still wearing his anxiety like armor. Marcus recognized the look. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. Can't sleep? Marcus sat on a nearby bench, maintaining respectful distance. The man startled slightly, then relaxed when he recognized Marcus from the intake process earlier that day. I don't trust it yet. Any of it. Feels like it's going to disappear. I get that. I lived in a truck for 3 months before I bought this place. Took me a year after finding the bonds, before I stopped waking up expecting to be back in my truck, hungry and cold. You're the guy who found the money. Everyone talks about it. I'm the guy who bought a building for $50 because I was desperate. The money was just hidden here. Could have been anyone who found it. The man studied him carefully. But it wasn't anyone. It was you. And you could have kept it. Run off somewhere. Lived like a king. Instead, you built this place. Why? Marcus had been asked this question dozens of times by reporters, investigators, and curious visitors. But coming from a veteran who was still in the thick of the struggle, who hadn't yet found the path out of darkness, it felt different. More important, because being homeless broke something in me, Marcus said honestly. Not my spirit or my determination, those actually got stronger. It broke the illusion that the world was fair, that service was rewarded, that if you did everything right, you'd be okay. I learned that you can do everything right and still end up sleeping in a parking lot, wondering if you'll survive the winter. He gestured around the restored station. So when I found money, more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, I had a choice. I could fix my own broken situation and leave everyone else to figure out theirs. Or I could fix the system that broke me in the first place. Or at least try to. This center won't solve homelessness. It won't fix the VA, or heal everyone's trauma, or undo the damage that war does to people. But it's something. It's proof that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can change it, even if just in small ways. The man was quiet for a long moment. I killed people in Iraq. Civilians. Probably. We took fire from a building, and we returned fire, and when we cleared it afterward, there were bodies, women, children. The brass said they were enemy, or combatants, but I saw their faces. I see them every night when I close my eyes. Marcus felt the familiar weight of shared trauma, the burden that so many veterans carried in different forms. I have my own ghosts from Afghanistan. Different details, same soul-crushing guilt. Therapy helps. Time helps. But it never goes completely away, does it? No. And being homeless, having everyone look through you like you don't exist, it felt like what I deserved. Punishment for what I did. That's the PTSD talking. You were a soldier following orders in an impossible situation. You don't deserve to suffer on the streets. You deserve help, healing, and another chance at life. That's what this place is for. The man's eyes filled with tears he quickly wiped away. I'm not sure I know how to live normally anymore. None of us do at first. Normal has to be relearned. That's why we have counselors, support groups, other veterans who understand. You're not alone here. That's the most important thing I learned. The isolation of homelessness is almost worse than the physical hardship. Here, you're part of a community again. People who get it, who won't judge you, who want to see you succeed. They talked for another hour, Marcus sharing his story in more detail. The man, his name was David, gradually opening up about his own journey, from decorated soldier to homeless veteran. By the time they parted ways, David's posture had shifted slightly, the defensive armor beginning to crack, allowing the possibility of hope to seep in. 6 months later, David was employed as a peer counselor at the center, using his own experience to help new arrivals navigate the difficult process of rebuilding their lives. He'd completed trauma therapy, found an apartment, and started reconnecting with family members he'd pushed away during his darkest years. You saved my life that night, we talked in the concourse, David told Marcus during a staff meeting. I was planning to leave the next day, go back to the streets, probably not survive the winter. But you treated me like a person, like my story mattered. That made all the difference. Marcus deflected the credit, as he always did. But the truth was undeniable. The Riverside Veterans Center wasn't just providing housing and services. It was creating a community where veterans could find the human connection and understanding they needed to heal. The congressional hearings in Washington brought Marcus back into the national spotlight he'd tried to avoid. Testifying before the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, he explained the journey from homeless veteran to philanthropist, from discovering bonds to creating the center. Mr. Webb, a congresswoman, asked, "What would you say to those who argue that we already have sufficient programs for homeless veterans, that your center is duplicating existing services?" Marcus took a breath, organizing his thoughts. "Congresswoman, with respect, if existing programs were sufficient, I wouldn't have been homeless. Neither would the 500 and counting veterans we've helped at Riverside. The VA does important work with limited resources, but there are gaps. Long wait lists, bureaucratic barriers, insufficient funding. Our center fills those gaps, provides immediate help without waiting lists, offers intensive support that overwhelmed VA facilities can't always provide." He leaned forward, making eye contact with the committee members. "But here's the thing, we shouldn't have to exist. In an ideal world, no veteran would ever experience homelessness. The fact that private centers like ours are necessary is an indictment of how we've failed to care for the people who served. I'm grateful I had the resources to create Riverside, but I'd much rather live in a country where it wasn't needed." The hearing room was silent for a moment before the committee chairman spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Webb. Your candor is appreciated, and your point is well taken. This committee will be reviewing legislation to increase funding for veteran homelessness prevention programs. The legislation passed 6 months later, allocating $500 million specifically for transitional housing and support services for homeless veterans. It wasn't enough to solve the problem completely, but it was progress. And the language of the bill specifically cited the Riverside Veterans Center as a model for what successful intervention looked like. On the 5-year anniversary of purchasing the train station, Marcus stood on the platform, now beautifully restored, with benches and landscaping, and reflected on the impossible journey. 5 years since he'd sat in his truck with $73 and no hope. 5 years since he'd gambled everything on a building that nobody wanted. The center now housed 100 veterans in various stages of transitioning from homelessness to stable housing. They'd expanded to include job training programs, partnerships with local businesses, mental health services, and educational opportunities. The main concourse, once filled with graffiti and decay, now served as a community gathering space with resources, computers, and areas where veterans could find assistance, or just sit and feel part of something larger than themselves. Tommy approached with news, got the final numbers from the accounting team. Between the original settlement and careful investment, we've got enough in the endowment to keep the center running for the next 50 years at current capacity. Plus, 3 other cities want to open similar facilities using our model. Marcus smiled, looking at the building that had saved his life and allowed him to save others. Remember when you said I was insane for buying an abandoned train station? I said you were either insane or brilliant. I was wrong, you were both. Tommy clapped him on the shoulder. You took the worst period of your life and turned it into hope for hundreds of people. That's pretty incredible, Hermano. That evening, Marcus retreated to his apartment, pulling out a journal he'd started keeping. He'd never been much for writing, but Grace had convinced him that documenting the center's creation would be valuable, both for future expansion and for his own process of making sense of everything that had happened. He wrote about the veteran who'd arrived that morning, 23 years old, fresh from deployment in Syria, discharged for injuries and lost in civilian life. About the woman in her 50s who'd served in the Gulf War and spent 15 years homeless before finding Riverside. About the former Special Forces operator whose invisible wounds had left him unable to hold employment until the center's specialized trauma program gave him tools to manage his PTSD. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: service, sacrifice, struggle, and the search for meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent to their suffering. The same threads that ran through Marcus's own. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Martinez. Watching the news. Another veteran center based on the Riverside model is opening in Phoenix. What you started is spreading. Well done. Marcus set down his phone and returned to his journal, writing a final entry for the evening. People ask if I'm surprised by how this all turned out. The answer is complicated. 5 years ago, I thought I might freeze to death in my truck. I thought I'd used up all my chances at a normal life. I was wrong, but not because of luck or fate or finding money. I was wrong because I made a choice to keep trying. To believe there might be something better ahead. To use whatever resources I found to help others. The bonds were hidden for 70 years, evidence of corruption and conspiracy, bought with blood, as that station manager wrote. But blood can fertilize new growth. Suffering can create compassion. Struggle can build strength. The money was tainted by its origin, but we've cleansed it. Through use, turned something built on greed and violence into something that actually helps people. I'm not special. I'm not a hero. I'm just a veteran who got lucky and made some decent choices about what to do with that luck. There are hundreds of veterans just as deserving, just as capable, who didn't find hidden bonds in train stations. My hope is that the center, and others like it, can provide them with the opportunity that random fortune provided me. Because that's what this is really about. Opportunity. The chance to rebuild, to heal, to discover that life after service, after trauma, after hitting rock bottom, can still have meaning and purpose and moments of genuine peace. The train station, this beautiful old building that nobody wanted, became my salvation. And now, it's salvation for others. That's more than I ever could have imagined when I spent my last $50 on what everyone said was a worthless pile of bricks. Marcus closed the journal and walked to his seat, the window, looking out over the grounds. Veterans were gathered on the platform, some just talking, others playing cards, a few sitting quietly and watching the sunset, all of them finding, in their own ways, what he'd found here, a place to belong, a community that understood, and the possibility of moving forward instead of just surviving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans needing help, administrative details for the expanding organization, continued work on advocacy and legislation. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself to simply appreciate what had been built from disaster and desperation. a train station bought for $50, a safe full of hidden bonds, a homeless veteran who refused to give up. And from these unlikely elements, something beautiful and lasting had emerged, proof that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive. That suffering didn't have to be wasted. That one person's choice to help others could create ripples that spread far beyond what they could ever imagine. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, and Marcus stood at his window watching until the last light faded. Then he headed downstairs to the community dinner, where 100 veterans were gathering to share a meal, share their stories, and share the understanding that they were no longer alone in their struggle. This was home, not the building itself, but what it represented: the transformation from abandonment to purpose, from isolation to community, from desperation to hope. And it had all started with a man in a truck, with $73 and a crazy idea about buying a train station nobody wanted. Sometimes the best destinations are the ones we never planned to reach, found only because we were willing to keep moving forward, even when the path disappeared into darkness. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to please subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.